thank you very much for the invitation to share a few thoughts this evening. I'm particularly pleased to be joining a transition discussion, having met Rob Hopkins back in 2007 when he was just in the process of setting up Transition Totnes, which of course has now turned into a movement that's not only very prominent here in England and across the UK, but also in other countries. And you know, that was only 14 years ago, and just look how far we've come. I remember speaking with Rob in those days about climate change and what needed to be done and the urgency of the issue. And it was only very few of us, even then, who were really paying attention to that subject. But today things have transformed. And the thing that's also very encouraging is how the climate change discussion these days is joined by a very much more high profile discussion about the state of nature. And this is very, very important because for too long, to my mind, we've had an obsession with carbon, which, although very important, is only about half of the challenge that we face. And of course, the other part is very much linked to the decline of the quality of nature and the unraveling of ecosystems, which is why during recent years, and indeed very recent years, that instead of only talking about a climate emergency, there is now much more of a discussion around the related twin emergencies of climate change and ecological degradation. And indeed, even here in Cambridgeshire in 2019, the City Council and South Cambridgeshire Council declared a joint nature and climate emergency at around the same time that the British government did that. And so what I'm going to talk about this evening is nature recovery in the context of those twin emergencies, and also to say something about why we might want to be really focused on that, what is the point of doing this, and then critically how we can do it. So in terms of why, well, for anyone paying attention, you don't need much of a reminder of the statistics and the trends that are in play. And when it comes to the climate change emergency, we now see carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere rocketing to a level not seen on this planet for several million years, probably going back to the time of the Pliocene, between 3 to 5 million years ago, was the last time we had carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere comparable to those of today. And this has happened very quickly, now at about 415 parts per million. When I was born in 1960, we were at about 315 parts per million. So the rate of change is very rapid indeed, and the consequences of that will be familiar to everybody, linked with the effects of rising temperature on ice melt, ocean expansion, changing seasonal patterns, more extreme weather events, and so on and so forth. And of course, in parallel to the driver of fossil fuel combustion being largely responsible for that, is the contribution that's coming from the degradation of nature. And this is where these two things are twins. It's not one or the other that's important, it's both of them, because the climate change is causing nature to be impacted in different ways, but also the degradation of nature is driving more carbon into the atmosphere from deforestation, from damage to soils and damage to marine habitats and coastal habitats, where the degradation of those systems is reducing the amount of carbon trapped there and driving it into the atmosphere. And the scale of this is truly shocking, despite all of the efforts over the years to slow down deforestation. Over recent years, the rate of forest loss has actually gone up. And at the same time, as that forest is being replaced mostly with agriculture, it is agriculture that is causing the degradation annually of soils, to the point where some 25 billion tons of topsoil is disappearing from the land and going into the sea. And of course, that degraded soil is then more susceptible to the impacts of climate change and drought, for example, then further jeopardizing our food security. So these two things are fundamentally related to one another, and of course have been going on now for some time. And actually, I was conducting some research at the weekend, writing a chapter for a green economics book, and just went back through some of the literature just to remind myself of the stark nature of some of the warnings that we've had now going back decades, and indeed the scientists' warning that was presented to the world back in 1992 at the time of the Earth Summit. now nearly 30 years ago, all of those issues that I just described and more, set out in some graphic detail, painting a picture of a world that we now live in, where these things have not been managed and they've become worse. And so this then is a question of what nature recovery is for, really, because if we have been ignoring these warnings for several decades, why should things change now? And actually, this is really quite an important part of the discussion, because things are changing in really quite a fundamental way at the moment. It's been going on for a few years, but it's now become quite noticeable. And that change is really about the economic discourse. So nothing much really to do with climate change per se, or nature decline and the loss of species and habitats, but actually about the reason why we haven't done much about it until now. And if you look back to the time of the Earth Summit, and indeed the several decades, or the 2 decades at least immediately after that, you find this very prevalent narrative in politics and in the business community, whereby it was held for a very long period that environmental degradation, whether it be climate change caused by carbon emissions, or deforestation, or the plunder of fisheries, or the clearance of natural grasslands, all of these things, to a greater or lesser extent, were actually justified as being the price of progress. We heard that, it's regrettable to damage these ecosystems, but actually it's necessary in order to sustain economic growth, to create jobs, to provide for people's needs, and to reduce poverty. That was very much the narrative, as though nature was worth absolutely nothing. But over the years, we've had a series of expert reports and processes that actually told us that that is completely wrong, and that if we continue with climate change emissions, and if we continue to degrade the natural world, then actually there will be some very serious costs for humankind. This is obvious to anyone with a basic training in ecology or a concern about climate change, but for politicians and business leaders and the people who ran finance ministries and economics departments in universities, they didn't think that. They thought that somehow there was a balance to be struck, nature on the one hand, economy on the other. And since the economy is all about people, then it's always nature that's going to be the loser in striking that balance. But things are beginning to change. And it started to change in about 2005 with the publication of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was a global study involving many expert economists and ecologists, who concluded that if we didn't slow down the rate of nature decline, that this would then limit the human ability to end poverty. They made a direct relationship between poverty reduction and the state of the environment, and said that if we can't halt and reverse the degradation of nature, it won't be possible to be able to conserve the prospects of improving people's lives. And then following that, we had the process called the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, reaching a very similar conclusion, putting some numbers on the value of nature to the economy, thereby dismissing this idea that somehow looking after nature was harmful for economic prospects. And then most recently, actually last month, the British government published the Dasgupta Review. This is a Cambridge academic, Partha Dasgupta, publishing his review for the British Treasury on the value of nature and biodiversity for the economy, again reaching a very similar conclusion, that the services provided by nature are essential for human well-being and indeed economic development. And then you start to look into some of the details of this, and these will be quite familiar headings now. For example, our food supply depends upon healthy nature, pollinating insects, healthy soils, recycling nutrients, ecosystems that recycle, store water and replenish aquifers. All of these things underpin global food security. And when it comes to climate change, probably the cheapest and quickest thing we can do, alongside the deployment of renewable energy at scale and shifting our transport system, is to conserve and restore the natural world. And that's both catching carbon in healthy soils, some of which can be producing food at the same time, but also the conservation and the restoration of forests globally. And when it comes to water, which is vital for all of human endeavor, bear in mind that it is ecosystems that are endlessly recycling that material and putting it back into the environment in a usable form for people to be able to utilize. And very often we look at water as something which is provided by water companies or comes in plastic bottles. Actually, there is a clue in the name of ecosystems like rainforest. Not only are they having a lot of rain falling upon them, they're pumping billions of tons of water into the atmosphere every day, and that's traveling very long distances. And then, of course, during this most recent period, we've understood the massive contribution to human health and well-being from access to beautiful natural spaces. Even urban green spaces can have a therapeutic beneficial effect, but people having access to diverse woodlands and riverside ecosystems and habitats, visiting the coast to enjoy beautiful views and the sound of birdsong and the sight of beautiful scenery, this has a hugely beneficial impact on people's well-being. And so all of this learning that's been accumulating during recent years is telling us that actually all of those warnings, they were real, and the reason why we didn't do anything about it was wrong. And now we have every good reason to be investing in nature recovery alongside the related subject of going to net zero carbon in a very short time. And that framing of nature recovery is really quite important, because I've spent most of my career until quite recently talking about conservation. And conservation is a very, very important thing and remains extremely important. But in this country and elsewhere, conservation tended to be about hanging on to the last little bits of good stuff that we had left. We designated sites of special scientific interest. We had national nature reserves. We had species recovery and species protection targeted at things that were disappearing and down to remnant populations. And all of that was extremely necessary. In some cases, it was very effective in hanging on to what we've got. But if you look at all of that work that came from those technical processes telling us about the value of nature, you realize that actually we don't have enough of it to meet all of those needs of humankind and the needs of biodiversity and those 8 million odd species that share this planet with us. We don't have enough natural habitat left to be able to either look after that diversity of the natural world or to be able to meet the needs of a fast growing human population. And so this is the reason why we now move the discussion from conservation and hanging on to the bits that remain and into a program of nature recovery, which is about putting stuff back and putting stuff back at scale. And so what we know from the science of declining species and the disappearing wildlife that's been so forensically documented in this country, probably better than anywhere else in the world in terms of farmland bird populations, for example, or some of our more iconic insects like butterflies, we've got unusually good data. And we can see that the data is showing that nature has been in a pretty steady decline now for some decades. And so that invites us to ask the question, why is that? Because we have had conservation, species have been protected, and we have had sites of special scientific interest. But actually what we're realizing now is that although that was essential, it wasn't sufficient. And this then brings us to some of the science around the phenomenon of so-called island biogeography. So this is the science that looks at species change over time in relation to the area of habitat that species have. And the more you have fragmented little patches of habitat isolated from other areas of habitat, the more likely it is that things will disappear over time. A drought, a fire, a disease outbreak, species A becomes extinct in place X and can't colonize place Y because it's too far away. And over time, the species becomes extinct in place Y2, and then it becomes extinct in place Z, and it can't recolonize. And so this is why we see, this is one reason why we see this continuing decline of nature, even though we have been doing something through the lens of conservation. So then what should we do in terms of this new idea of nature recovery? What can we do to make that work? Well, another very important report that I'll mention very briefly was one that was published 10 years ago by Sir John Lawton, one of our most eminent ecologists and conservationists. he published a report for the British government called Making Space for Nature. And he concluded that if we are going to have the conservation of our wildlife and natural habitats long into the future, then we needed to move from these isolated little penny packets of land that we have, much of which are extremely important and very, very good for wildlife, but we needed to move beyond that to have more such places that were bigger, of better quality, and crucially connected to one another. More, bigger, better, connected. And that process then involves a discussion around how we are going to do habitat restoration in this country at large scale. And so that brings me to the question of how we do nature recovery. And happily, I find myself at the moment in a position at Natural England where we are looking at actually a really positive set of ambitions and new tools that are coming in the policy making space that are going to help us to do this. And actually some of this work is already underway and some of it quite nearby to Cambridge, which everyone can go and have a look at. But essentially what we have is the convergence between quite a few different ideas coming together at once. And our job at Natural England we see as being able to stitch all these pieces together to do exactly that job that Sir John Lawton set out of having more, bigger, better and connected nature. So what are those different parts that are now coming into play? Well, one thing, which is again quite an important framing of all of this, is the government's 25-year environment plan, published in early 2018 by the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, setting out the government's ambition over a quarter of a century. And the critical thing about the 25-year plan, aside from all of the really good stuff that's in it, and I'll mention some of those things in a minute, is this idea that the job today of environmental policy, unlike the past, is not to slow down the rate of decline and make things a little less bad. The overall objective of the 25-year plan is to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. So that sounds like quite an easy thing to say, and it is, but actually if we do that, it bucks an historic trend where at best we've just been making the curve of decline a little less steep. Now it's about bending the curve back towards recovery, and that's government policy, and we've never really had that before. And so the 25-year plan is setting the frame, including in the 25-year plan what is for Natural England the most important idea that we're working with, which is the idea of a national nature recovery network. And I'll say more about that in a moment, but the Nature Recovery Network is where we intend to join up lots of different policies that are now coming through to create exactly the kind of impact that Sir John Lawton called for 10 years ago in his Making Space for Nature report. And so that Nature Recovery Network will depend upon quite a few different things coming together. So one of the different things that will come together will be the government's new agricultural policy. Now, irrespective of views about departing the European Union, one of the things that most people can agree on is that the common agricultural policy of the EU was not a good thing for the environment, focused initially on production and producing more and more food, and then more latterly on subsidizing farmers for maintaining farmland in farmable condition. The environment didn't really get much of a look in, certainly not in the central strategic role that nature recovery now has to play in underpinning future food security. And so the common agricultural policy is going to be replaced over the coming years with a new policy that's based upon public money for public goods, is the phrase that ministers have used. And so this is switching subsidies from farmers for managing land for food, and instead paying them for services. So this is about paying farmers for delivering on what the public wants. What does the public want? Well, in the context of the new policy, the public wants more wildlife in the countryside. The public wants more beautiful landscapes to enjoy and have access to. The public wants cleaner rivers in which to swim and fish and to go bird watching. And the public wants also carbon to be captured from the atmosphere. And the public probably wants their houses to flood less by making healthier soils that absorb water rather than it running off down into people's homes and businesses. So the policy, which is currently being written, it's under construction at the moment, but the direction of travel is very clear. It's about switching into payments for public goods, and those public goods will include the creation of new habitats for wildlife. So that's going to be one plank inside the nature recovery network. We'll be working with landowners, farmers, people managing land, tenants who are producing food on estates, to be able to come together with a program that can start to join up nature recovery with food production. These two things have historically been pretty separated. There's been attempts with agri-environment schemes of different kinds, and they've been quite good. But this is a much more strategic drawing together of the overriding need for nature recovery and food production. And then we have the Environment Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which in there is some really important new tools to be working with into the future. One is the idea of biodiversity net gain. So anyone looking out of the train window between here and London, and indeed on the north side of Cambridge as you drive in and out, you see lots of new houses going in. And so those houses until now have been built with some nod towards environmental priorities, but not really being built with any kind of strategic contribution to nature recovery. But that will change with the passage of the Environment Bill, when it will become law for developers to ensure that they lead to a biodiversity net gain in how they deliver their housing projects. So houses will still be built. The population of the country is still going up, and there's tremendous pressure for housing in some parts. But that process in future will have to embody a biodiversity net gain. And that will require house builders to be effectively buying biodiversity improvements on other land. It may be on the same land that they're operating their new developments, but this will create further opportunities to put momentum behind nature recovery proposals. And then alongside those two tools of net gain and the new farm policy, we have pretty ambitious plans coming from government in the form of its nature for climate policy. And there's two big strands there. One linked to peatlands, of which we have a lot just up the road here in the Fens, and also another linked with the establishment of more tree cover across the country. 30,000 hectares per year was the target that was set out behind that policy. And so this is a very substantial commitment backed by, I think, £640 million of public money to be improving and restoring peatlands and establishing a lot more woodland cover in order to not only catch carbon from the atmosphere, which that will do, and also to slow down emissions from peatlands in particular, but will also create opportunities to, for example, use that tree budget to be linking up fragmented areas of ancient woodland, thinking about the Lawton principles and how species will be disappearing from our woods because we've got tiny fragments left. Reconnecting those woodlands using that tree budget, including through a process of natural regeneration, is another string to the bow of the nature recovery network that we're hoping to be pushing forward in this country during the years ahead. And then, of course, if we're going to have all of these different tools, and I've mentioned some of the more important ones there, then it's going to be necessary to have a framework within which to fit those tools. So where should we be prioritizing habitat creation, and what kind of habitat should it be? Well, another element in the Environment Bill, which is going to be very important on that, is the mandating of so-called local nature recovery strategies, LNRSs. This is going to be a spatial planning process. And at the moment at Natural England, we're trialing this in 5 places across the country. These will be county level processes. So Cambridgeshire will be doing this. And at the moment, we're trialing this in Cornwall, Buckinghamshire, Northumberland, Cumbria, and in Greater Manchester to work out how best to structure these processes. Because basically what we're trying to do is involve different actors and interest groups at county level in working out where the best bits of nature remain, chalk grasslands, woodlands, natural rivers, bits of fen, bits of bog, and then to be looking at that spatial analysis of what good is still remaining, and then to think about how we're going to connect that all up. Where are we going to put the new woodlands to connect these two woodlands? Where's the new grassland going to go to be able to connect these areas of separated grassland, and ideally at the same time to clean up the river and to reduce flooding? So those are the kinds of questions, and hopefully leading to answers that can command some level of consensus for then targeting these different tools and resources coming from policy to be able to work together towards that nature recovery network. And it's not only the policies that will be important there, also bringing in different partners, others who invest in different ways in the natural environment. So infrastructure providers, for example, East-West Rail, the connection between here and Oxford, a major infrastructure project. What could that organisation be doing to contribute to the nature recovery network? Because they might well say that they're interested in net gain as well. And it may be actually that in a short time, hopefully a short time, that it will become common practice amongst infrastructure organisations to be looking at net gain as something they do as a matter of course, because at the moment it's only expected to apply to town and country planning legislation, so house builders. But infrastructure providers like rail and road, water companies, and of course the NGOs, the RSPB, the wildlife trusts, and the National Trust, who are also all investing very considerable amounts of effort into nature recovery at scale, including in the Wicken Vision up the road here at Wicken Fen. So this is a process that will unite policy tools, so farm investments, but also net gain, and then also different actors who can be contributing to this process of nature recovery. And this will be a new opportunity for everybody to be working together at county level, and that will be coming through in the Environment Bill, which we expect to become law later this year. So all of that is then geared against targets that will be in the Environment Bill. Those of you who are veterans of environmental policy and campaigning will remember the power that came with the Climate Change Act of 2008, having a long-term target in it for carbon reduction. And so the Environment Bill that will come later this year will be creating what I hope will be parallel targets for nature recovery, for biodiversity, which equally will be legally binding upon government, so that we get that constant return of attention from ministers and others to the questions at hand. Because if we're not meeting our targets, then obviously something needs to be done differently. So we're hoping that that will be a powerful tool in being able to create the beautiful and sustainable environment that we now know from epic research projects of the kinds I've mentioned tell us that actually is what we not only know is good for us, but actually makes economic and social sense at so many levels. So in terms of what that means in practice, I mentioned that there are a few projects that we're already getting underway at Natural England, where we're trialing some of this thinking already. One of my favourite examples is the Purbeck Heaths in Dorset, where last year, working with a whole range of partners, including private landowners, as well as statutory bodies and the non-governmental organisations, we created the country's first super national nature reserve. It covers around 34 square kilometres down on the Isle of Purbeck, and is taking forward those principles from Sir John Lawton's Making Space for Nature report and putting them into practice by recreating habitat to reunite 3 national nature reserves down there. So this is a vision that's taken some time to put together, but now is turning into reality. Another one is in the Avalon Marshes in Somerset, where an old national nature reserve there, Shapwick Heath, is now being added to by some very large scale wetland creation around the so-called Avalon Marshes, leading to some really quite dramatic increases in the wildlife and biodiversity there. And then up the road here at the Great Fen, we have 2 national nature reserves in the form of Woodwalton Fen and Holme Fen, with the previously degraded peatland agricultural soil in between the 2 of them, now the subject of a major ecological restoration project that goes under the banner of the Great Fen. So some of this stuff sounds quite ambitious and quite visionary, and it does have to sound that, but at the same time, it does have to be that too, but at the same time, it also needs to be real. And so it's good to have examples of where this kind of thinking is already being played out. And there are plenty of other examples across the country where Natural England and its partners are getting stuck into this. And closer to home here, Cambridge Past, Present and Future, have already published a nature recovery network piece for the Cambridge City area. If you look at their website, you'll find that. And in fact, I did a tweet earlier on that maybe we could share after the meeting, or maybe put it in the chat. Actually, there's a link there that gives you a sense of the priorities they have in mind. So looking to the fenlands to the east of the city, the Wicken Fen vision coming down from the north, some of the opportunities we have around the chalklands to the south, and then the Cam corridor and those chalk rivers that feed into it. Huge opportunities there for using those of the arteries of a nature recovery network. And actually the City Council recently published a really good report on the state of the chalk rivers that flow into the Cam, coming down from the chalk down towards Meldrith, Shepprith down that side, and also down towards Great Chesterford. There's some beautiful little rivers, but they're in a pretty shocking state, including the ones in the city like the Coldham's Brook. But these are huge opportunities for nature recovery and give us a template from which to work in being able to target the efforts that we can put in from the NGOs, the local businesses, and of course the City Council. And then we have the county level nature partnership here. Every county pretty much in England has a local nature partnership. Ours is called Natural Cambridgeshire. And that's a combination of local government, various businesses and non-governmental groups. Last year, they set out their vision to double the nature that we have in Cambridgeshire by 2050, a very compelling vision, and one that's very necessary when you realise that Cambridgeshire has almost the lowest amount of good quality natural habitat of any county in England. And then, of course, we have the work of the wildlife trusts and the living landscapes work that they've been doing for years to be able to bring this vision of nature recovery to life. And I have to say, actually, that work was ahead of its time. And now the world is catching up with that, which is a very good thing indeed. But the wildlife trusts remain an absolute engine room on all of these subjects. And of course, if we do this right, and if we do nature recovery right, we'll be catching carbon, we'll be reducing flood risk, and we will be making nature more resilient to climate change impacts into the future, thereby reinforcing that key point that we have to have in mind about this being twin emergencies. It's not only about climate change, but it's about nature recovery, because if we don't focus on nature recovery, we will lose much of our nature as a result of climate change. And as a result of losing our nature, there'll be more carbon in the atmosphere that will make climate change worse. But I do feel, having worked on these subjects now for quite a few years, that we are on the verge of moving into a new phase. I spent the first bit of my career trying to get people to even know that there was a problem. And then we got into the phase of debating what to do about it. And it looks like we might now actually be in the position of actually doing something. So I'm very excited and would encourage everybody in the Transition Town group and who lives in Cambridge to engage with the next period, to be working with the City Council, County Council, and to be looking at that local nature recovery strategy process that will follow in a couple of years, to be making the most of that and to be getting this city to be the green leadership hub that it needs to be. We've got some leading institutions here, the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, Cambridge Zero. These are world leading institutions, and they would be all the more credible, I would say, if they looked like they lived in a city that was taking these subjects seriously where they actually are, right here in Cambridge. So I will cease speaking there. Very happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.